My name is Dewald. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Innovation in Legal Education at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law, and I'm also in my 5th year as a PhD student in Learning Sciences at the College of Education, under the direction of Dr. Kirsten Butcher. I'm excited to talk to you today and share my knowledge and understanding of some topics that are increasing in importance not only in legal education, but in education in general. And since I work in the legal education field, I'll be referencing that area quite a bit, but all of the lessons contained in the presentation can absolutely be applied to other educational fields. Today, we're going to talk about ORF. ORF isn't the name of some sort of monster, though it could be. ORF stands for Objectives, Rubrics, and Feedback. This acronym is key to teaching and learning and is growing in importance in legal education, especially with recent changes to the ABA accreditation standards, which we'll talk more about later. By the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of the following. First, you'll find out exactly what learning objectives are. We're going to define learning objectives, talk about what they are and what they aren't, and how they can be written to guide your students into a deeper comprehension of the materials. Then, we'll talk about rubrics. Rubrics are a scoring tool that we can use to measure student progress towards your teaching and learning objectives. They're also quite important in communicating expectations to your students, so we'll spend some time discussing them. And finally, feedback. In legal education, there's a call for more formative assessment and feedback. Formative assessment and feedback is a way that we can let our students know how they're performing throughout the semester. Additionally, we can help our students become more self-sufficient in their studies through strategic feedback. You'll notice a common thread of student self-sufficiency, or metacognition, through the entire presentation. This is an important facet to the discussion, especially when considering the overall impact of objectives, rubrics, and feedback. Now, I realize that each of these topics deserves an hour themselves just to achieve adequate coverage. My goals for this presentation are modest: to introduce you to the topics and cover at least some of the importance and interconnection between these 3 topics, and to show you how you can get started in considering how these can be used in your class. As a student, I've often wondered, why am I even in this class? I don't even understand what we're trying to do. I'm probably not the only student in history to think this, and I consider myself a relatively diligent student. Most of the time, it's because the learning objectives of the class aren't communicated well, if at all. Now, in defense of the instructors, when we teach something, we don't approach it all willy-nilly and just talk about whatever comes to mind. We have a syllabus. We generally follow the syllabus from day to day and week to week. And we have things like PowerPoint slides to guide us and help the students understand the content. But do we consider exactly what the students will be learning throughout the day, the week, or even the semester? Do we think about what each class meeting will tell the learners? Do we know how one class period specifically builds our learners' knowledge from one to the next? If the answer is maybe or no, then we should think about using learning objectives. Let's start by talking about what a learning objective is. A learning objective is a statement that explicitly tells our learners what knowledge, skills, and attitudes they'll have after instruction. As you might guess, these objectives aren't necessarily for you, the instructor, but for the learner. Therefore, learning objectives need to be student-focused. Each advancing learning objective should build on the next and support the overall goals that you as an instructor have for your learners. You might be thinking, geez, I need to write objectives for all 20-some of my class periods? Okay, so writing learning objectives for your students might not be at the top of your things to do before the semester starts list, especially when we have competing interests in prepping materials, doing research, and getting back into the groove after a long break. But it's a very important piece to the learning process. Sometimes, learning objectives are dismissed by teachers and professors. I mean, come on. Students are taking the course. They've read the description, and it should be obvious what they're going to learn, right? Torts. They enrolled in the course, they're going to learn about torts. Unfortunately, as we'll soon find out, students will learn about torts is not a very good learning objective, and there is a good and not so good way to write learning objectives. Another reason we should consider using learning objectives is to help with the structure of the class for both the teacher and the learner. For the teacher, It will help them structure the semester, quarter, week, day in a meaningful way. So what's that mean? If we're trying to build a structure of knowledge for our students, understanding which bricks of knowledge are in place before others helps you identify gaps in your coverage of the topic. Also, by creating these objectives, you'll be able to see the intersection of learning content, activities, assessments, and feedback. For each objective, what kind of activities can we have our students do? What sort of cognitive processes do we want them to engage in? If the objective is measurable, how will we assess their performance? And finally, how will we provide them feedback to nudge them, the learner, to the next cognitive level? By thinking about all of these angles, the teacher can gain a better understanding of their course as a whole. Students can gain a different kind of structure with learning objectives. In 1960, Professor David Ausubel examined the impact of information presented prior to a lesson, called an advanced organizer, on a student's ability to learn. Later research on advanced organizers, conducted by Mayer in 1979, found a very interesting result. Advanced organizers can influence learning. So it seems there might be a connection between organizers and learning objectives. A short but well-written learning objective presented before a larger body of information can assist learners in organizing and comprehending that information. So think of learning objectives as a sort of advanced organizer or scaffolding of the incoming information. What constitutes a good learning objective? Perhaps you've written or seen some objectives that go a little something like this. Students will learn about the law of torts. Or how about students will gain an opportunity to learn about the three main types of torts? These are examples of not so well-written learning objectives. Then what does a good learning objective look like? Well, a good learning objective is SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and targeted. Let's talk a little bit about each of these. In order for a learning objective to be effective, it needs to be specific and measurable. The examples that I mentioned earlier and what you see here are descriptions of what will happen in class from a teacher's perspective. They're not really specific and they can't be easily measured. So these are teacher-focused examples and tell the student what they'll learn in an inefficient way. A better learning objective would be focused on what specifically the students will be able to do by the end of class. Students will identify and distinguish between the three main types of torts: intentional, negligence, and strict liability. Or, students will be able to analyze court decisions that created and continue to shape the law of torts. Both of these learning objectives are specific and, most importantly, measurable in some way. Good learning objectives are attainable and relevant. And now this is a big one for us. Without getting too far into the differences between novices and experts, we need to understand the level of understanding and prior skills our learners have coming into the classroom. Many of our students coming into law school have a minimal exposure to things like thinking like a lawyer or any of the substantive topics taught during the first year. That puts them firmly in the novice camp. Now, knowing that novice learners need to, at least initially, have ideas conveyed concretely, we can write objectives that push our learners from concrete to the abstract style thinking like a lawyer skills. In explicitly mentioning our objectives to the students, we can make the learning process more focused and efficient. This means that we need to give our students attainable but challenging objectives. If they're novices, don't give them an objective that can't be accomplished. Don't throw them into the deep end. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating for the objectives to be super easy or sugar-coated, but I am advocating for taking some time to think about them and making them just hard enough and attainable. Lev Vygotsky, a prominent educational theorist in the 1930s, called this the zone of proximal development. Attainability can be communicated by specifying how the learner will demonstrate mastery or perform a skill. For example, through a group-based simulation, learners will analyze a contract and offer suggestions for improvement. This is specific, telling them what they're going to do; attainable, by telling them how they're going to do it; measurable, based on their simulation performance, probably scored by a rubric, which we'll talk about later; and attainable. We've entered a time in class where they can learn actively through a simulation. Good learning objectives are also targeted to the learner and the desired level of learning. As we mentioned before, learning objectives are about helping the student understand what they're going to learn and how they're going to learn it. It gives them a structure and helps them connect the incoming knowledge together. Good learning objectives make use of a range of methods to facilitate deep comprehension. One of the tools we have to make this depth of comprehension judgment is Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy was developed by Benjamin Bloom in the 1950s as an illustration of cognitive processes that move from the more shallow, at the bottom, the foundation, to the more deeper processes, toward the peak, the thinking like a lawyer verbs. When we're writing learning objectives, we can reference Bloom's taxonomy. We should consider where our learners are cognitively, and in doing so, we can select one of these levels and write an objective for it. Remember and understand are considered shallow levels. These make great objectives for early in the semester or when you're starting out on an entirely new topic. At the top, we have evaluate and synthesize. These are deeper levels and are more cognitively demanding. We'll use these when we know our learners have a grasp of the material and sometimes for the end of a unit. So let's look at examples of both. Here are two examples of using Bloom's taxonomy to write objectives. Through a written paper, learners will apply the prima facie elements of battery to a fact pattern distributed in class. Or, learners will evaluate a peer's argument and offer their own suggestions for improving the strength of an argument through written feedback. Each of these addresses a level in Bloom's taxonomy: apply, which is in the middle, and evaluate, which requires a deeper cognitive process. Keep in mind that when we're using tools like Bloom's taxonomy to write learning objectives, we're slowly trying to push their abilities to the deeper end. So, as the unit or semester goes on, adjust your learning objectives to include verbs from higher up Bloom's taxonomy. So, writing learning objectives provides a sort of map to the top of Bloom's taxonomy for a given unit. So remember, when we're writing objectives for our students, we're trying to provide explicit guidance and structure as to what they're going to learn in a semester, a week, or a day. Be sure to keep your objectives SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and targeted.